What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another episode of Race Car Problems. Today, I'm going to be unboxing my new Carrillo rods and my new CP pistons for my engine build. And while I'm at it, I'm going to do some comparison to stock pistons, my JE pistons, and we're also going to compare the stock rods to the CP Carrillo rods that I bought. And I'm also going to share with you guys some information that I've researched about the different bolts available for the rods. So if that's something you're into, stick around. So if you've been watching my IGTV episodes, you already know that I have to get bigger size pistons. So I decided to go with CP Carrillo pistons this time instead of the JEs. I went up in the compression to 10:1. We went with an 87mm bore instead of the 86.5 that was currently in there. So here are the pistons. They come in a nice package. Obviously, all this stuff is fragile, so you don't want to risk of damaging it during transportation or shipping. This is how it looks like when you open the box. You have your keepers for your wrist pins. Then in here, we're gonna find piston rings. When we remove these, we find that there is a sticker, a little brochure, talks about the ring gap. You got street, high performance, drag racing, road racing, and nitrous turbo supercharger applications. Obviously, that's the one I'm using, is the turbo supercharger application. The ring gaps obviously vary from street use and drag racing. I will leave that down to the scientists. I'm not gonna mess with that. I will follow the instructions that they give me. Also, you got the piston spec sheet. This is very important, not necessarily for us, but the machine shop. This is the specs that the machine shop uses to correctly bore out the cylinders and check the clearances. And then we got the pistons. Obviously, my 2JZ is a 6-piston engine, so I have 6 pistons and then 6 wrist pins. Now, as you can see, these are flat pistons. What that means is they're pretty much flat on the deck side. They do have some engravement for the intake and exhaust valves, obviously, so there's no clearance issues. If you compare that piston to the stock piston, you can see right away that the top in here is concave versus here it's flat. So a couple of things we're going to compare here. This is your 10:1 compression. You can see how it's flat on the top. This is JE piston. This is 9.5:1 compression. It has a little cave in here. It's hard to see in the camera, but it's concave just a little bit here versus here. And then you got your stock piston, which is majorly caved in comparison to these pistons. That's what creates the compression difference, because the more room you have in the cylinder, including this caved in area in the piston, the more room you have, the less compression is created from the air, that fuel that gets into the cylinder. So the more flatter the piston, or when even sometimes it becomes bulkier, that means it's higher compression. So another important thing about forged pistons is the weight. When you go forged, the metal's stronger because of the way they're designing it. Therefore, you can shave off a lot of unnecessary weight on the unit. So if you compare the stock piston to the CP piston right here, you can see that the stock piston is a lot larger on the side skirts, which makes it heavier. What's important about that is the heavier the units inside the engines that are rotating, they require more force to be moved and stopped, etc., which means you're actually losing the horsepower created based on the weight of the item that's moving. So naturally, if you were to just replace piston, like a forged piston that's smaller in comparison to stock one, and not change the compression whatsoever, you might actually see a horsepower gain with no other changes because it's a lighter unit. That's important. That is why we go forged. Lighter material and stronger at the same time. You can't go wrong with those two things. So we're going to take this a step farther. I have a weighing scale here, and just for entertainment reasons, we're going to compare the weights of all these pistons that I have available to me. Starting with the stock piston right here, we're gonna weigh it. It is 372 grams. That is your standard 2jzgte piston, 8.5 to 1 compression, standard size of 86 millimeter. Then we're going to compare it to our JE piston, 9.5 to 1 compression, 86.5 millimeters. So there's 0.5 millimeter difference here. So this will technically have slightly more material than your stock 2jz piston. 336. So you already have 30 some gram difference here just by going forged. And then we're going to compare the CP piston. This is 10 to 1 compression and it is an 87 millimeters. So this is 1 millimeter wider in diameter than your stock piston, and it is half a millimeter wider than your JE piston. That's 9.5 to 1. 336 grams. So with that said, the stock piston is the heaviest, and the JE piston and the CP piston are actually just about the same, which is quite interesting because this CP piston is actually higher compression, so that means it's got a little bit more material here on the top, and it is half a millimeter wider than your JE piston, which means there's actually more material used on the CP piston than there is on the JE piston, which means that if I had them apple for apple, if I had them both at the same size and same compression, I guarantee you that the CP piston would actually be lighter than the JE piston. So now we're going to talk about rods, and one thing I'm going to mention is why I went with Carrillo and CP versus other brands. Doing some basic research, I found that there's different types of rods, different brands, going from Eagle rods, Manly rods, BC rods, and even Wiseco rods. The one thing I researched and caught my attention right away is that Eagle rods, Manly rods, and BC rods are actually made in China, and Wiseco rods are made in Japan. I don't know if the quality is any less in comparison to Carrillo, but what I do know is that Carrillo is made here in the USA. They're down in Irvine, California, which is down the street from me, and the tech support is right there. If I need to call them, I just call them. If I need to replace one part only, again, they're down the street, and they'll probably be more than willing to replace just one part instead of buying the entire box. If you buy Eagle rods, Manly rods, or BC rods, now you got to talk to the distributor here in America, and then possibly they'll order just one rod for you, or they won't even replace one rod. I'm not sure. I haven't had to deal with it, but that was my theory, and this is why I picked Carrillo rods. Made in the USA, down the street from my house. I just feel a lot safer and more confident using their items. When we're talking about these different brands, obviously the prices vary quite a bit, and they have different horsepower ratings as well. These Carrillo rods that I picked up, they're rated for anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 horsepower. All the other rods I was looking at, like the BC rods, they're rated at about for 700 to 800 horsepower. And it goes down from there with Manly rods and Eagle rods. Wiseco was my other choice. They have rods called boost lines. They're actually rated for, I think, roughly 1,400 horsepower, which is way more than what I'm planning to make. And they're made in Japan, so I definitely don't have any issues with the quality that they might be in. But again, it's going to be a lot harder for me to try to communicate with the manufacturer if I have to ever replace any parts or have any questions. All right, so here we got the Carrillo CP rods. As soon as we open up the box, we see another piece of paper with specification. This usually will go to the machine shop. They're gonna use this information to do their final measurements and whatnot. Here we got a brochure once again with some stickers, and then we got some information about their bolts. Now, when it came to buying rods, the big thing that I've spent most time on is researching the actual bolts. There's many different types of bolts used for connecting rods, and they all have different specifications and life cycles. So I'll get back into that in just a minute. Let's finish unboxing these rods. So right here we got fastener assembly lubrication. This is used for all bolts, different brands. I mean, these obviously are for the cpcarrillo rods, but even when it comes to ARP bolts, they use their own fastener assembly. It helps with torquing all of the bolts. And then we got this box, and each one of these boxes has a connecting rod in it. Again, I'm using a 2jz, which has 6 cylinders, which means it has 6 rods. And here is the rod. These are H-pattern rods. I'll get back into that in a minute and explain a little bit more about that. But as you can see, the finish quality is great. Everything looks perfect. There's no imperfection in the casting. And then we got the bolts right here. They're torqued down, so I can't take them apart just yet. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the rods and the research that I did on them. You have your stock rod, which is cast steel. It's decent. The VVTi turbo rods will actually hold up to 600 wheel horsepower. It's been proven by many people, but the problem with it is they fatigue over time. Now, you don't know if they're going to last you a year, 2 years, 3 years, or just a month when you start boosting a lot. Obviously, they do hold 600 horsepower. People usually don't have issues with them, but if you're tearing into the motor, you just want to get rid of this. These parts are becoming to be 20, 30 years old, so it's time for replacement. So aftermarket rod companies offer a design that's called an H pattern. The way they cast the rod, it creates extra strength right here on the side. This is actually usually where the rod bends. When the rod's going up and down, it tends to tweak right here and it bends like that. And that's what usually happens with the stock rods. Once that bends, it becomes a weak spot, and then eventually it detonates, blows up, and destroys your engine. So they came up with these H-beam design rods. All different brands carry these H-beams as well. So this isn't just like a Carrillo thing design, but this right here, the way that this is designed, it's guaranteed to withstand a lot more horsepower than your stock rod. And obviously it's forged. Like I mentioned earlier, anything forged is stronger, and it could actually be created lighter based on the material used. So that is the main difference that you can see right here on the rod. And then there's the bolts. Now the bolts, it's a whole other story. I did a lot more research on that, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Let's compare the weights of these two rods and see where we're at. All right, so starting with the factory rod, which is cast steel, we're looking at 758 grams. That's how much a stock rod weighs with ARP bolts in it. Then we got the Carrillo rod with their car bolts. 608 grams. So as you guys could see, it's quite a bit of a difference in grams. Now you multiply that by 6, and we're looking at some serious savings in the weight and the rotational mass of the engine. So we compare the stock rod to the H-pattern Carrillo rod. Now let's talk about the actual bolts. The Carrillo rods are very expensive rods. It was a hard purchase to swallow, to be honest, because BC rod, which I mentioned earlier, is rated for roughly 800 horsepower. That was going to be my choice, and this Carrillo rod is twice as expensive as the BC rod. And when you go down all the way down the list to like Eagle rods, for example, this is almost 3 times as expensive. So generally, looking at the prices, you're not going to want to go with a Carrillo rod because of the price. But doing some more research about the hardware that they use, which is the connecting rod bolts, I realized that this purchase is actually better for me because of the bolts that they use. What I mean by that is stock rods, they use stock bolts. The second you take the rod apart to check the bearing and replace the bearing or do some machine work, whatever, you have to replace the bolts. So it is highly advised to upgrade to ARP bolts. Now, ARP bolts have two different types of bolts that they offer for this type of size. They use ARP 2000 bolts and then the ARP 625 plus bolts. The difference between these two is the material that they use and the way they design the bolt. Now, I don't know the details about manufacturing bolts, but there's obviously different processes, and the way these processes are made, they create different tension strength on the bolts. When the rod's going up and down, when the rod's going up on high RPMs, the piston that sits on top of it and the rod wants to get separated. The second this piston gets to the top, the rod gets pulled right back down by the crank, and there is a lot of tension that gets created right here on these bolts. These are usually the bolts that tend to fail over time when you start doing a lot of horsepower, because the strength that's going up and down with the RPMs, that creates so much force on these bolts that this is the weak spot. So the RP 2000 bolts, they actually are rated for 220,000 psi. Now, I don't know what that is in comparison to horsepower or the boost you're using, but we are going to compare these numbers in comparison to each other. So ARP 2000, 220 psi. Then ARP also offers the 625 plus bolts, which are a little different design, and those are rated for 260,000 psi. So obviously you have a difference here already. When you're building an engine, for me, I look at the higher numbers because I want to make sure that whatever number I end up putting out, I'm going to be safer in comparison to, let's say, the ARP 2000 bolts versus 625 plus. If you're just rebuilding an engine, light applications, street use, you're not going to be pushing a lot of horsepower, you don't have to go with expensive bolts. Just upgrade them a little bit. That way you know that they're safer than stock. But for my application, because the engine's going to be revved up a lot higher than stock, I'm going to be pushing 2 to maybe even 3 times the horsepower that the engine came from factory. I want to get the best bolts possible. That's when I researched the Carrillo bolts. Now, Carrillo has a proprietary steel. What that means is they have a design on their steel that nobody else can do, because they came up with it and they patented it, and they have a secret sauce for making metal and their bolts. So Carrillo offers 2 different types of bolts for their rods. One of them are WMC steel bolts, which are rated for 220,000 psi. That's pretty much the same as the ARP 2000. So you have a choice right there. When you get the Carrillo rods, you can basically get the WMC steel bolts, or you can get the car bolts. The car bolts are multi-phase bolts, and they're rated for 285,000 psi. This is what I got. So in the comparison of the 4 different bolts that I could get for my application, the car bolts ended up being way higher on the psi tension strength than any other bolt. Again, I want the highest number possible just to feel safe that whatever horsepower I'm running and the application I'm using them for, they're going to be the best part possible. Also, the other thing between the Carrillo bolts, the WMC and the car bolts, the WMC bolts have a torque cycle life of 15 to 18 times. What that means is these bolts, when you torque them down to spec, over time they become fatigued and they tend to stretch. Once that happens, these bolts are no longer good. Their rating is out the door. Might as well replace them. Do not risk it, because they might come apart under a heavy load. So Carrillo is the only company I actually found that wrote on their website their life cycles. What that means is the WMC bolts, they say 15 to 18 torque cycles as long as you don't over torque them. That means they guarantee you that you can torque these bolts down 15 to 18 times. After that, remove them, replace them. Versus the car bolts, the multi-phase bolts, which I got on my rods, they're guaranteeing you a lifetime cycle as long as you don't over torque them. Now, why is that important, you think? You're building an engine, you're putting it together, you don't expect to ever take it apart, right? So if that's the case, yeah, ARP 2000 or 625 bolts, they may be good for you, which, by the way, I could not find the information online clearly, but most people on the forums are saying they have 12 to 15 time use. just kind of like the WMC steel bolts from Carrillo. Now, going back to why would you need so much use out of your bolts? Well, take this for example. When you take your rods to a machine shop and they're brand new in the box or used and you're rebuilding the engine, they're going to torque it 3 to 4 times to check the bearing clearance, sometimes even more. So you're already using up a quarter of its life just by one rebuild. Now, if you're using your engine for a race application and you're at the track and you suffer some oil loss, you're gonna take the caps off the bearings that are accessible underneath the oil pan to check at the track to see if the engine's still healthy. You're gonna take away another two cycles out of that easily. So that adds up real quick. On a race engine, you usually take the engine apart at the end of the season and you rebuild it. So when you use an ARP 2000 bolt or ARP 625 plus bolt or the Carrillo WMC bolt, that adds up. So within 2 or 3 seasons, you're going to reach that maximum limit of 12 to 18 torque cycles, and you're going to have to replace these bolts. And these bolts are not cheap. The ARP 2000 bolts are the cheapest. They're somewhere, I think, in like a range of $200 plus. The 625s start getting into the range of $300 to $400. And then the Carrillo car multi-phase bolts, they're over $500. That's what actually makes this rod so expensive in comparison to other rods, is because of the bolts. That's the research that I've done. Don't quote me completely on it because I only researched what I could. Do your own research, but this is the information I'm just trying to share with you guys that I found very interesting and very useful as to why I'm paying so much for this rod in comparison to your other rods with ARP bolts. So to sum things up, I went with forged rods and pistons. Obviously lighter material, holds more horsepower, reduces the weight of the engine components, freeing up the horsepower. Also, I went with cpcarrillo rods and pistons is because they're a local company made in the USA, supporting our local business, and they are always available for tech support or individual part replacements, which on the long run would definitely help you quite a bit versus having to buy a whole new set of pistons and a whole new set of rods from other brands. The other thing is the bolts. Again, I did a lot of research on the bolts just to justify why I'm paying so much for these rods, and I'm happy with my purchase because as long as I don't over torque these bolts, they're gonna last me a lifetime, which is great because I don't plan on getting rid of my 2J anytime soon, and I expect to rebuild it a few more times in its life, which means I'm gonna get to reuse these and not have to worry about replacing them, which will be additional costs to my rebuild. So out with the stock, which is super heavy, in with the new forged quality pistons and rods. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hopefully I explained some things. Hopefully you guys learned something out of this, and maybe it'll help you with your future purchases. If you are looking for best prices on rods and pistons online, hit up my buddy Freddie. I'll leave his link in the description. He will give you the best possible cost online. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.